Well, good morning. How you doing, doctor?
I'm doing well. How are you doing, doctor?
I'm doing well. It's good to talk to you.
Good to be here with you. Thanks for the invitation.
Me too. I'm looking forward to this conversation. Very, very important topic and very timely for our time and season in life. So it should be a fascinating conversation.
I hope so.
But before we get into all the details of that, let me ask my favorite question, which is what's the best piece of advice you've ever received?
Oh my gosh. I think the best piece of advice. Oh, there's two that come to mind. First, no te dejes, which is Salvadoran women telling other women, don't let people just push you around. Uh,
Love that.
um, so that's my grandma's voice in my head. And then I think as it relates to the conversation we're having today, just put your head down and work. Like, do what matters to you and just wake up every morning and do the thing that matters to you, and whatever else is happening, it's none of my business, right?
That's right. That's right. I'm always curious about people like yourself. We never get really on life about people, mentors, being coming alongside us in our journey. Who are some people that stand out for you that were particularly influential in your life?
Yeah. I would say my 10th grade English teacher, who was the first person who sat down with me and told me how to revise writing. So I wrote an essay that I think he kind of liked, but was like, you could do better than this. So he sat with me and actually showed me how to do a revision of
Oh,
an
wow.
essay, which was obviously game changing because I wrote a whole book. And then I think kind of other than like the obvious, my mom, who is my, superhero of a human. I think there are two people that became my dissertation co-advisors who just kept going to bat for me when others were saying that I wasn't cut out for what I think is beyond just a curiosity or an interest, but what I think is a calling. And for two people to continuously over and over say, don't count her out, don't count her out, that I think kept me in the game long enough to prove that I actually had it in me to do what I want to do in this life.
Yeah, the dissertation process is a long grind.
Yeah. Yes, years.
Yeah, that's so special. I'm curious how your upbringing as a daughter of a Salvadorian immigrant in Los Angeles influenced your interest in sociology and migrant studies.
Yeah, I grew up, both my parents are Salvadoran immigrants. Through my research, I learned that they had grown up as unaccompanied young people in Los Angeles. That isn't something I grew up knowing, right? I only found out in 2014, and that was 2 years into doing the research that I was doing for my book, Sin Padres ni Papeles. My parents both came out of El Salvador, out of their migration experience, out of that unaccompanied growing up, not talking about them, right? Like once our family formed, once my dad, you know, found God and joined a church and then kind of brought my mom into the fold, that was sort of the starting point for our family. I didn't really grow up knowing about El Salvador. I didn't grow up knowing a ton about how they grew up. So I think it's kind of the opposite that people often assume that I somehow knew a bunch about my family and that's what motivated my interest. It was the not knowing and
Okay.
the sort of like something is missing here. It doesn't make sense to me why we were instructed to say that we were Mexican. My older sister and I were instructed to say we were Mexican, learning later that that was because of anti-Central American sentiment in the US, especially in a very Mexican Los Angeles. It didn't make sense to me why every couple of months my grandma had to go back to El Salvador and learning about the visa process and like having to prove that you're not meant to stay in the US. All of these things that I just didn't really get. And the more I read and the more that I studied the topic of migration, Central American migration, um, the history of Mexican community formation in Los Angeles, I started to wrap my head around what it actually meant to be me, right? And like who my family was in this context. So, yeah, it was the not understanding.
Right. I was I get asked this question a lot being African American. That is a terminology because all Hispanics are not the same. So is did you connect more with being Latino or Latina or Hispanic, or did it not matter when you were growing up, that distinction?
Yeah, I've never really liked the term Hispanic.
Mm,
I think it's like its rootedness in Spanish colonization in Latin America. I wasn't like 4 years old. Like, I don't want to be,
right.
it wasn't that. I just like, didn't really like Hispanic. I don't know. It always made me a little uncomfortable. And I think I knew it in the context of, again, church, where it was Iglesia Bautista Hispana. It was the Baptist Hispanic church, right? And I was just like, I don't really like that. I think when I went to UCLA for undergrad, our sort of Latino studies or Latinx studies or whatever was Chicano studies. And that also wasn't me. I wasn't, Mexican American, reconnecting with indigenous heritage. So I've sort of gravitated toward Latina or Latinx in a broader sense. When we're talking like white, black, Asian, if you're going to put me in a category, it would be Latinx, I guess. But when I'm with Latinos, I am either Central American or very specifically Salvadoran, because there's so many references, I think, in the US culturally that are rooted in Mexican Latino identity. And
Right.
I don't really know those things. Even as, like I said earlier, I also don't really know the Salvadoran version of that because I didn't grow up getting those things passed down to me. But I definitely just try to like get closer and closer to being able to say, like, I'm just Salvadoran, born in the US, right?
Right. So I know when I did my dissertation, that's something that drove me to want to study that. What drove you to research and discover the coming of age and unaccompanied children in America and stuff from South America?
Yeah. I when I was in undergrad at UCLA, I mentioned that was like my drive to understand really what the heck was going on in my family and like why we were where we were and why did we operate the way we did as a family. I was interested in studying for a long time immigrant, second generation immigrant youth identity. I was interested in understanding Central American youth identity. I knew it in the context of immigrant students, and I became really involved in the undocumented student movement at UCLA on campus. And then when I went across town to USC for grad school, sort of graduated into the organizing scene in Los Angeles more broadly. In that context, again, surrounded by what I now would say is like the normative undocumented immigrant young person. It's the image we all saw in, from the Dream Act in the 2000s to about 2012 when DACA came on the scene, Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals. That movement was really driven by young people who had parents or adult caregivers in the room, allowing them to be the student and become the organizer and then lead the charge there. So when I started studying immigrant youth identity, I was interested in group formation, organizing spaces. I was told to, by my dissertation advisor, learn the landscape, learn the social landscape, which like what I tell her to this day, like, what the heck did that even mean? Like, she wanted, like, you're sending me to out to Los Angeles, like, learn the immigrant landscape, which is all of Southern California, right? So someone told me that there was a group of undocumented Central American youth that met at a coffee shop in Pico Union, Los Angeles, and that they would welcome me on a Friday night and I could just go meet these people and see if I wanted to be a part of that group. And that was the first group I was introduced to where I learned of the strength of the garment industry in downtown LA, which I didn't know existed as prominently as it still does to this day. It's the first time I learned of immigrant youth being child laborers in the garment industry, and that these young people were growing up as such because they didn't have parents in the US to allow those opportunities to go to school. No one was paying their rent for them. No one was doing their laundry for them. No one was making their dinner at night. So it sort of turned everything that I had read in books, everything that I'd seen in organizing, everyone that I knew from being in college for 4 years. I was like, wait a minute, this is not this is not at all who we're talking about, or who I personally know. So I ended up spending 6 years embedded in that support group for young people. And then from there, really started to learn the language of, unaccompanied youth, child labor, or the difference between labor and work, right? And became really interested in how young people, quite like the undocumented adults that we have been reading about for decades, were leaving home to build houses and start businesses and put their siblings through school. And it's just like the complete opposite of everything I had known. So I spent, yeah, 7 years just studying that.
So for these undocumented children, kind of tell us, I'm sure you probably know some of this, how do they end up getting here? There must be something that spurred this. What is
Yeah.
driving that population to make that dangerous trek? I mean, I've heard about how all the terrible things that happen sometimes along the way to get here. What's
Yeah.
driving them to come or leading it?
So I opened the book with a chapter on departures, and the story I tell there is one that is very much rooted in what we know historically about Central America and Mexico, right? There is political, economic, and social insecurity that displaces people, and that these forms of insecurity are really rooted in, again, colonialism, legacies of colonialism and disempowerment, and then also more recently US intervention and US imperialism across Latin America. So civil wars in Central America that have led to repression of certain groups, young people being targets of silencing, persecution, of displacement for the sake of not having generations of organizers against the imperial US state. So I talk in the book about how these young people, even in 2012, 2013, they are responding to the instability, the poverty, the violence that comes from legacies of colonialism and imperialism. But when you sit down and interview them, when you talk to them, they're not saying, all of these generations of privatization. They're telling you things like, um, I didn't see a future here. I couldn't go, there weren't opportunities for me to learn, for me to grow, to become the person that I wanted to be. So I really try to ground their conversations with me in a broader context, a structural context, this, the global economy, but then also think more deeply about how young people come to see that they don't have a future in the country in which they're born. So they're migrating in pursuit of an imagined future, right? And they set these migration goals independently. Again, who do I want to be? What do I want to become? But also in conversation with their families. They set collective goals of family uplift, of, again, starting a business, building a home. Even if a young person themselves had only gone to school for 3 years, they wanted to complete their educations, and if they couldn't do it themselves, they would support their siblings in doing that. So there was a lot of stories that I heard over and over again about how young people had set migration goals that were rooted in, again, the future they imagined for themselves, but the future they imagined for their families. And that's not something that you typically hear a 9-year-old saying, I'm really thinking about the collective future of my family and the future of my siblings. That's the adult job, right?
Right.
So thinking about how this version of childhood, of adolescence, and then the transition to adulthood isn't normative, in that they're adopting roles that we don't typically assign to children, and that's what really motivates their migration, and then their persistence in jobs that they know are exploitative and harmful for them.
So I'm sure, like with me, when you start doing this research, you find things you're surprised by.
Yeah,
What surprised you most about their story?
I think the whole the whole thing just surprises me. To this day, someone read back an excerpt from my book and it had me in tears, because I was like, wow, I can't believe people are living like this. Even as I've been studying this since 2012 and writing about it, I think it still surprises me that there are children working in factories, turning our rooms over at hotels, serving our food in restaurants, and we just kind of obliviously go about our lives, right? And we are in one fight or another for justice, but we don't think that it is children that are sustaining our economies or our lifestyles. So that shocked me. But I think when it sort of comes down to the data itself, what sort of surprised me the most, I think, is that even as there is so much suffering that comes with children being displaced from their families and their communities, even as there is day to day suffering in low wage work, people making $6, $7, $8 a day in Los Angeles, you know, people, there's one person that worked about 66 hours a week. I remember very explicitly, and I asked him, where, how do you sort of expense your pay? Like, where does it go? And he gave me the itemized list of where his money goes, and he says, I have $5 at the end of the week to feed myself over the
Wow.
weekend until he starts work again on Monday. And like that, I just, someone arriving to the US at 14, and that is the life, right? That surprises me. But then the fact that even in all of that, that my participants and their friends and everyone that I sort of met in the field across the 6 years of research, that they came together and admired each other's strength, and they looked to each other for guidance and wisdom and sort of next steps, because the people that had been here for 6 years could say something to the people that had been here for 2 years, right? I think that sort of collectivism that is born, that even in deep suffering and deep poverty, young people are not deviant and wandering around and become these sort of, as media or politicians would like to frame it, that these are young people who really are interested in preservation of self and preservation of community.
This study, I'm sure you've run across a lot of heartbreaking stories. What are some stories that inspired you in this journey?
Yeah. One of my favorite stories, I'll say two. Two of my favorite stories are, and I forget the names that I gave them in the book. There were two young people that were garment workers in Los Angeles, two young men, both from Guatemala, both indigenous, and they met in a garment factory. And they both had interest in martial arts and exercise and just like boys doing boy things. And they both talked. I interviewed them individually, and neither one of them said the name of the other person. And it is only in them elaborating on their story that I realized that they had been talking about each other. So one of them had joined a karate class, and he was really interested in moving out of the garment industry and becoming a karate instructor, and unfortunately had injured his knee and could no longer practice martial arts. He had a friend who we met in the garment factory who was also interested in martial arts and karate, and was interested in things like boxing and running and anything that they could do um, to counter the sort of repetitive motions they did in the workplace in the garment factory. Again, like 16 hours a day of just on the same machine, right? Um, so these young people came together, the two of them, teenage boys, came together and started a running club that would meet on Sunday afternoons, because these young people are working Monday through Saturday, 6 a.m. to 6 p.m. And they would go to church on Sundays and then have like Sunday afternoons off. So they started a running club, and they talked about how they became a community of young people that initially started as them and their friends, young boys, but then started to include women in the group, and they would run together. And then older men started to join the group because they realized, oh, these young people are starting a community and they're active, and a consistent place where they could meet with one another. And that was, to me, again, a sign of how the individual becomes the collective, and how young people are not just worried about themselves, but they really started to think about, who is my community and what does my community need? And both of these young men would talk about the running club as something that they saw that they needed. They needed friends, they needed physical activity, they needed to be outside, right? Because even if you're going from work to home and then at church, or you're going to like they're always indoors, right? They're just moving from space to space. So they talked about like identifying needs that they had and creating spaces where those needs would be met individually and collectively. And then there was another young person. I remember naming him Gael in the book. He migrated to Los Angeles from Guatemala at the age of 16 after his father passed and his mom couldn't make ends meet for him and his siblings. Uh, he came to the US thinking that he could work a few hours a day and go to school and finish schooling. Didn't happen. He worked in a garment factory. He worked in a restaurant kitchen. Had his wages stolen over and over again. He got a job as a florist assistant in the downtown Los Angeles flower market. It's this like huge warehouse of just stalls of floral markets. And he learned there that he loved floral design, and he had this dream of becoming a party planner. He wanted to make floral arrangements for parties, like quinceañeras, weddings, church, like big arrangements in churches. He, during our interview, told me that he was not ever able to go to school, but through working was able to stop his three younger siblings from unaccompanied migration. And he said, people look at me and they maybe say, you've been here for 5 years and you've done nothing with your life. But he said, my accomplishment has been making my mom proud, right? And making sure my siblings didn't come here to suffer the way I've suffered. And that to him was an accomplishment that wasn't college degrees. He didn't learn English. He didn't do all of these things that we sort of assign value to. And then 2 years ago, I saw him in Los Angeles and he had opened his own floral shop in LA with the help of some people who were willing to sign the documents for him. But I see him on Instagram, I see him on TikTok posting all of his designs, and he really did the thing, right? Like he did what he wanted to do, which was become a shop owner and design floral arrangements for people. And that to me is, it takes a little bit longer, maybe, right? It requires different forms of support, but he was able to push through the barriers.
So I think we made this issue of migration into a political football. And we forget about the people. If you could think of some policies or an approach to dealing with this issue, because what you're talking about, you're describing is horrible. How do we get children in factories working ungodly hours for minimum wage, and how do they survive in LA? LA is not cheap. If you have a great job in LA, it's hard to live. So
Right.
how do we change the system so that we don't have kids being exploited like this?
Yeah, I end the book on that exact question, and I sort of follow for folks that read Sin Padres ni Papeles. I follow the structure, the organization of the book. I talk about the displacement. I talk about the arrival context, the fact that many of my participants had long settled relatives living in the U.S., that young people thought that they would be the source of support, that they could arrive to the doorstep of their aunt, their uncle, their cousin, who'd been in the US for 12 years, 15 years, whatever it was. But that person said, I can't have you here. Like, I can't afford to have you here. I can't have a child worker here. I just can't take you in. And that again is the chapter 3 is one entitled Disorientation, where young people are disoriented by the fact that now they're totally independent, right? And they have to find a place to live, and now they have to find a place to work on their own. But they're also emotionally disoriented because they are still just teenagers living in their teenage bodies, not really understanding all the day-to-day changes, and they feel betrayed, they feel disillusioned, they feel disappointed that now, and afraid, right? All of the fears and stressors that come with now realizing you didn't just migrate unaccompanied, you're now growing up unaccompanied, and that wasn't what they anticipated. So I talk in the conclusion of the book about how we should not create, we should understand that the root causes, right? I remember at the beginning of the Biden administration, we were promised a humane approach to immigration that would address root causes. And what happened? The vice president got sent to Guatemala, and the words that came out of her mouth were, "Do not come here. If
Right.
you can hear my voice, do not come here." That is not an appropriate address of the root cause. The root cause, again, is intervention. It is corporations privatizing resources and degrading the environment. It is the disinvestment in systems of education for the sake of investing in military and border enforcement. So, if we're going to talk about root causes, let's really talk about root causes, in which case we would have to acknowledge that Central Americans are refugees in the US, people that are displaced by US funded military regimes that have persecuted generations of individuals, particularly indigenous populations in each of those nation states. We should really talk about that and grant some kind of legal protection for people. That would have helped then the long settled relatives of the recently arrived kids to say, actually, yeah, I do have the income and the space and the security to take you in. And that wouldn't have left young people so vulnerable, right? We need to talk about workplace rights, workplace protection, regardless of immigration status. Workers have the right to workplace protection and the right to livable wages in the US, right? There's that layer. So that if, say, unaccompanied children are not recognized as refugees, if their long settled relatives are not recognized as refugees and able to take them in, then kids would, if they end up in workplaces, have safer workplaces. Right? We need to talk about housing policy. There's so many ways, like if we don't want to do this, well, how about this, right? Like, and
Right.
I try to really tackle that issue. But one of the things that I try to stay grounded in the population that I researched, right? Unaccompanied migrant youth workers. One of the, I think, sort of absolutely essential steps, regardless of whether you want to go micro change or macro change, is we need to really get in tune with the fact that immigrant youth in the US do not all have parents or an adult caregiver, regardless of relationship to the child, who is taking them in. There isn't always an adult in the room that then enables children to be children as we sort of understand it in the US context. So that means also accounting for, whether it be at hospitals and clinics, at schools, at food banks, at homeless shelters, the fact that there isn't always an adult to sign the guardian line or to sign the parent line. And we need to trust that children know what their needs are. So if I've heard of so many young people in across California that have shown up at food banks and they're being denied food because they don't have a parent or guardian. Why can't a child under the age of 18 access food without,
Right.
why can't a child under the age of 18 access housing, overnight shelter? The young people that I interviewed ended up enrolling in adult English language schools, at 7:30 p.m. after they finished a full 16-hour shift at work. And that was because I talked to some administrators at the adult English language school that said, we know they're minors, but what are we going to do? Tell them they can't learn any English? Like you can't go to any school? But we need to change our sort of conception of who youth are and what resources they have access to account for the fact that it isn't just immigrant youth. There are homeless and runaway youth. There are children of incarcerated parents. There are foster youth who are in need of services that are denied to them because they don't have someone signing that parent or guardian line on forms and eligibility documents, right?
Right. So if someone is hearing this podcast and going, I want to learn more, I want to get involved in being a force of change, what advice would you have for those who are interested?
Yeah, I would, I'm an academic, I'm a researcher. So my first sort of tidbit would be to start reading. Like, I really think there's so much great work. There's some books dating back to 2014, which was the onset of the unaccompanied child migrant crisis. I'm thinking of Susan Terrio's Whose Child Am I?, which talks about children in detention facilities. There is a book published in 2020 by Lauren Heidbrink called Migranthood, which talks about how migration, like childhood and adulthood, there's this phase now in the life cycles of migrant communities that is migranthood, movement is now inherent in a lot of the social, cultural, and economic structures of these communities because of those legacies of displacement. Um, there's that book. There is a book by Kiara Gali, Precarious Protections, which talks about children in the legal going through the legal system of getting asylum and their relationships to lawyers and attorneys. My book on child workers. There's so many pockets of the population, right? And I think first to be involved is to understand unaccompanied children aren't just one thing, right? And if you are interested in something about the legal process, you would get involved with legal organizations that are serving unaccompanied children, whether it be through funding, if you're a Spanish language speaker, through intake forms, or an indigenous language speaker, whatever, intake processes, the need for volunteers. You can donate backpacks to kids that are going to school. If you're interested in child workers, we really need to organize around labor rights and the representation of children's voices in that conversation. So, like, learning which pocket of the population you're interested in, I think would be the way to go. And then, really, at a very high level, any immigrant serving organization that is on the advocacy front would be an important avenue of intervention. Because, as we saw in this last election, and as you said earlier, immigrants are really weaponized. Immigration is weaponized. Immigrants are vilified and treated as sort of pawns in a game. And it is their daily, everyday lives, right, that we're talking about. It isn't just a really high level policy. It is a lived experience, and recognizing that, I think, is important.
Yeah, that's really important. You've done some amazing work here in what you're doing to try to bring awareness to the problem, because I had no idea exactly how these kids who've had like millions have disappeared into the
Right.
country. And I just no idea where they are because, like you said, they go to supposedly reunite with a family in the country, and that family says no. So where do these kids go? Somehow we have to deal with the fact that there are a lot of kids who are just not on the radar of people, and they're in a very dire situation sometimes.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, there's so, this is what I just said is there's so many pockets. There's when we hear about in the news 35,000 kids missing, 85,000 kids missing. Those are children who are apprehended at the border that are then placed with an adult, and something happens in that household and the kid is no longer at the place the government released them to.
Right.
But my book is actually focused on kids who are not apprehended at the border,
Mm.
which we don't know how many, right? Like there's no way to know how many, where, what. To my knowledge, my book is the first book that really gets into the reality of young people who are not apprehended, because it's so hard. I just happened to tap into this group that was meeting Friday nights from 7 to 9 p.m., right? I wouldn't have had a way of knowing where to find children who had not been apprehended at the border. But those missing kids is just who the government knows about. And then there's all these kids that the government doesn't know about, right? We don't know about. And I think that is like what truly is the magnitude of this issue. If we don't have that tabulation, we just don't know, which is why I say, like, to get involved, it really means getting involved in any immigrant serving organization, because you don't know who's walking around identifying or not as an unaccompanied child, because maybe they don't know that they're unaccompanied. I just gave a
Right.
talk actually at on campus here at UC Berkeley a few weeks ago, when someone in the audience said, "It wasn't until I heard you explain your project that I realized I was unaccompanied," because the experience is so normalized across Central America, across Mexico, and increasingly from South America also. Children leaving home is just a part of the reality of their lives, right? And it's upon arrival here that kids realize, wait, there's DACA recipients, there are undocumented adults, there are people with temporary and the categories only exist here, right? So learning that, even a college student at UC Berkeley learning through like a 20-minute talk that I gave that he was unaccompanied, like that is, we just don't know where people are and what services they do or don't have access to.
That's amazing. Interesting research. I'd love to ask my guests this question. As you think about the work you're doing and the impact you're having, what do you want your legacy to be?
Oh my gosh. I feel like we need to get my therapist on the call for that question. for that question because I always think about this. I always think about like, if I die, like what will people remember? And I'm not gonna cry. I think when I think about like what I want the meaning of my life to be, I would have always wanted to be perceived as someone who lived in service of others. I think, and that I mean, it kind of like makes me giggle a little bit that this like project, my career started, as I mentioned earlier, in a department where my advisors had to go to bat for me every year so that I wouldn't get kicked out of the program essentially because people just didn't think that a Salvadoran girl, like a woman, whatever I'm sure I was infantilized, but that I would be able to finish the program, that I'd be able to write a dissertation, that I'd get a job. So from that reality to my reality now, where I'm at UC Berkeley at the #1 sociology department in the US, talking about Central American children, my sort of context has changed a lot, but at my core, I'm still the same person, right? Like I'm still the person that just wants more people to suffer less, right? And you can put me on any stage, any platform, give me any power, and that will still be my orientation to the work that I do. So I hope my legacy is one of service and that I can model, like, even if you end up at the #1 spot for the thing that you do, the value should still stay the same, right? Like I'm still always going to do work for the sake of children, so that more people suffer less. I think that's my thing. I hope I go down as the person who has actually like lived that out.
That's amazing. Where can listeners find your book and connect with you on social media?
Yeah, you can find me on Instagram at booksbydr.steph. I'm on Blue Sky now. We left the other platform behind, but Steph Canizales there. And then my book is anywhere books are sold. I recommend Bookshop because it supports independent bookstores, but also Amazon, Barnes and Noble, Target, wherever you are, my book's there. And I appreciate so much, not only this conversation, but generally engagement with my work. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for doing this and for coming on and sharing information we probably didn't know about. We have our mindset on what kind of unaccompanied children are, but there's so many different versions of that. You kind of open our eyes to a much wider issue that's out there. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
As we close this podcast, what key takeaways do you want the audience to leave there from our conversation?
I would want people to take away that we all have more to learn and that we all have a role to play. We can all do something regardless of what our orientation is towards this particular population. We can all do something with the power that we have and the influence that we have.
Thanks so much, Doc. You have a great day, and thanks for what you do and for the information you're sharing with the world.
Yeah, thank you. Good to meet you.